Hello, everybody. I'm back with another video lecture, this time from Melbourne, Australia. Unfortunately, I don't have a great view. This is just from bedroom in my Airbnb. But anyway, I'm about to hop on a flight back home. I will be in the air and uh, too jet lagged to teach for the next couple of days. And so instead, here is a lecture for you guys about US westward expansion. So here we are. We'll be looking at the time period that we've been in for a while now, 1800 to 1860, looking at the transformation of US society during this time period and how it connects to the outbreak of the US Civil War in 1861. So here's a little Western landscape for you. I like this one because it shows interactions between US white settlers and indigenous folks. You can see these guys cooperating, working together, crossing the Great Plains, making their ways out into the Rocky Mountains. Um, Here is a meme that I made for you guys that I think does a good job of showing US attitudes toward the territory that they take over during this time period. So over here you see all the different peoples and cultures that are already out there in the West in 1800. You've got Great Plains indigenous folks, you've got Spanish missionaries, you've got, all this stuff going on, and US settlers look at it and they say, wow, look at all of this empty land ready for us to take. A little bit of manifest destiny there at work. So today, we are going to be looking at how the US goes from controlling this dark blue territory here to expanding out and taking over all of this stuff, basically south of Canada and north of what is today's Mexican border. So, how does the US go from controlling this little chunk here to exploding outward and taking over the all this stuff all the way to the Pacific? Well, you're about to find out. So, one thing to think about as we get started here is that the United States population is really massive at this time compared to the other groups in North America. So, the United States population around 1800 is about 6 million. And if you look at the other folks in what is going to be US territory, there really is not a lot of there's nowhere near as many people from these other groups. So Spanish Mexico does have a pretty large population, about 5 million people, but almost all of these guys live in southern Mexico or in the central highlands. So the people actually living in the northern parts of Spanish Mexico are very widely dispersed. And so the actual population in the territory that the US is going to take over is quite small. The numbers of indigenous folks have been reduced dramatically. We don't have an exact count, but it's less than 1 million at this point. And then the British in Canada and the French in Louisiana also have pretty small populations. So one of the big reasons that the US is going to be able to expand so rapidly is just they have so many more people in this territory than all the other groups combined. All right, so let's get into it. Um, so these are the territories that we're going to look at and talk about as we proceed westward. So we'll be starting over here in the original territory that the United States wins after the war with Great Britain. And then we'll be talking about these major chunks of land that the United States adds to the Union over the course of the next 60 years. We'll skip some little tiny bits. Don't worry about them. We're not going to talk about the British cession up here or the Gadsden Purchase down here. Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. We're going to be focusing on these big chunks like Louisiana, Texas, the Mexican cession, and the Oregon Territory. So before we do that, though, let's talk a little bit about why the United States is able to expand so rapidly. And as we've talked about before, when trying to explain why something happens, you can break it down into the motives for why somebody does something, the means, which is how they are able to achieve that goal, and then the justifications are what they say to make it seem okay. So the United States is going to go and grab a bunch of land, and how are we going to justify it? But so anyway, to start with, the motives are quite simple. The US has a rapidly growing population. And basically, everybody wants a chunk of this continent. So in the north, you have a rapidly growing population of small farmers. And these guys want to acquire more land, or often it's the children of these farmers who want to acquire more land so they can go out and get a start their own farm rather than having to divide up, their parents' farm or whatever with their siblings. And in the South, the demand for more farmland is even more intense, with slave owners rapidly depleting the soil on their plantations with these really nutrient hungry crops like tobacco and cotton. And so these guys are going to want to expand westward into the fresh and fertile soils of the deep South. Also, expansion will benefit US industrialists because it will uh, bring new resources, make new resources available, and also create new markets of farming communities that will demand US crops. So basically, everybody with power in the United States wants more land. How is the US going to do this? What makes it possible? Well, first of all, the US's large population, as we've already talked about. And another key factor that's happening here is the Industrial Revolution. So, as the Industrial Revolution is starting up in the US, this is going to unlock new technologies that are going to make it way easier for the United States to go out and project power deep into the continent. And two key factors here are going to be the railroads and then also the mass production of industrial era weapons like the Colt revolver and stuff like that. So it's just going to be way easier for the US to get people out there. And then when they get out there, they're going to have a whole new level of firepower that was not available to earlier empires. And for justifications, it's unfortunately quite simple. The basic idea here, as we've already talked about, was manifest destiny. So it was this ideological idea that the North American continent was essentially set aside by God for white Protestants to spread out and settle. And they also would then look at the other people already living there and say, look at these guys. They've been here for centuries and they haven't even done anything with it. It's still just this beautiful, uncorrupted, rich, natural landscape. So we're going to take it from them and develop it, farm it, extract the resources, manifest destiny. That's what God would want. So there we go. We got the motives, the means, and the justifications. It's pretty straightforward. It all lines up, and it's going to result in rapid US expansion over the next 60 years. So let's get into some of the big chunks of US expansion. So the first big addition to the Union happens in 1803, and this is the Louisiana Purchase. Which you can see here. It basically doubles the land area of the United States in a single stroke of a pen. So the United States is able to just buy all of this stuff from France in 1803. The reason this happens is in the early 1800s, Napoleon, who is the dictator and then later emperor of France, loses in his attempt to reinvade and re-enslave Haiti, which means that France has lost control of its most valuable North American colony. At the same time, France is fighting a bunch of wars over in Europe and they need cash. So Napoleon decides just to sell the rest of his North American territory for some quick cash so that way he can focus on winning the wars over in Europe. And he always figures he can come back to North America and conquer stuff later. So, anyway, the US buys all of this very cheaply. And the US then goes on to map out all of this territory for plans for future expansion. However, a lot of this territory, other than Louisiana and Arkansas, is not really great farmland. So there's not a lot of immediate settlement, but it shows a clear commitment by the United States for further westward expansion moving forward. Also, one other key short-term effect of this is it gives the U.S. total control of the Mississippi River and the key port city of New Orleans down here, which creates a crucial southern trade route. And that's going to open up the Deep South as a major cotton production and trade site. The next big territorial land grab that the United States does is the Indian Removal Act of 1830. So, what's going on is even though the United States already controlled a lot of this territory down here in the Deep South, they had signed treaties with a number of indigenous groups that had come to be known as the Five Civilized Tribes because these guys essentially cooperated with and also adopted a lot of U.S. Cultures and policies and stuff like that. So they had adopted farming. They had a lot of them had converted to Christianity. The Cherokee even had a constitution and a printing press and a newspaper. They had even started to adopt the practice of plantation slavery. But so Anyway, a lot of people didn't like this down in the South because they wanted to get all of this land for themselves, especially because a lot of this land was prime cotton land, and the Southern slaveholders wanted to gain access to it. So, anyway, in 1830, Congress and Andrew Jackson, who was president at the time, worked together to pass a law called the Indian Removal Act that is going to force all of the indigenous folks on this territory off of this land and move them out into the territory recently purchased by the Louisiana Purchase. So basically, move all these guys from the southeast out to Oklahoma over here, which is at this point crappy, crappy farmland, and nobody wants it. So Congress votes, they pass this law, and in 1830, the idea is all these guys now have to just basically sell all their property and pack up and head out to Oklahoma. The Supreme Court intervenes. They rule that this act is actually unconstitutional, saying that it's violating these legal treaties that the U.S. has signed, and that Congress can't just violate treaties like that willy-nilly. But President Andrew Jackson just ignores the Supreme Court, tells them to basically enforce the laws themselves if they care so much about them, deploys the army, and physically removes these folks from these territories over the next, decade or so. So the short-term consequences of this are absolutely horrible for the five civilized tribes. They lose access to their ancestral lands, which also just so happen to be excellent farmland. And a big chunk of them just straight up die during the removal process. Depending on which group you look at, it's somewhere between like 10 and 25% of the entire population just dies because walking from the southeast to Oklahoma is hard. As soon as these guys are moved out, the Southern slave owners move in and buy up all of this land, which it turns out is amazing for cotton production. And cotton production picks up like that thanks to the internal slave trade with enslaved folks being transferred from the upper South into this fresh farmland. And so cotton production is really going to take off after this act goes into effect. It also is going to result in the addition of new slave states to the Union, including Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, and Arkansas. Here's a little chart showing the population impact of the Indian Removal Act. Feel free to pause if you want to ponder it. But yeah, in general, bad. All right, next up, we've got Texas. So this is kind of a weird story, but how it works is originally, all this land was part of the Spanish territory of New Spain. And the northern border had always been a problem for New Spain, largely because they didn't have a lot of people up there. And the Great Plains indigenous groups that lived up there, especially the Apache and the Comanche, were very aggressive and difficult to work with and would frequently attack Mexican settlements and destroy them and take all their stuff. So, in an attempt to stabilize the northern border of their territory, New Spain invited in a bunch of U.S. White slave owners to come in and settle the east coast of Texas, which was, turns out, perfect cotton growing land. So, over the first couple decades of the 1800s, you get an immigration of people from the United States to Mexico, wealthy Southern landowners bringing in enslaved folks and setting up cotton plantations in East Texas. However, this whole setup kind of falls apart in 1821 because Mexico revolts against Spain and wins their independence. And in one of their very first acts as an independent republic, they ban slavery. So shout out to Mexico. 1821, 40 years before the United States even starts getting around to that. Now, anyway, so after Mexico bans slavery, this leads to some back and forth between the slave owners in Texas and the Mexican government down in Mexico City. Eventually, this leads to the folks in Texas declaring independence and seceding from Mexico and going to war with Mexico. They eventually win this war in 1836 and win their independence, becoming for 9 years their own independent little republic. Uh, Pretty soon after this, though, Texas begins asking the United States for the right to join the Union. And in 1845, this request is granted, and Texas becomes a state within the United States. The short term effects of this are one, this adds an additional slave state to the Union, and also leads to the creation of Maine as an independent state, whereas before that territory used to be part of Massachusetts, I think. But so anyway, Maine splits and becomes a free state, maintaining the balance of free states and slave states in the US Senate. This also leads to further conflict with Mexico because there is a disputed border, and it's unclear whether Texas starts or stops between this river, the Nueces River, or the Rio Grande down here. Of course, Texas thinks it goes all the way down here, and Mexico thinks it doesn't. So stay tuned for more conflict with Mexico in a second. But before we get to that, we've also got the Oregon Territory. So the Oregon Territory, I guess it's kind of nice. Instead of fighting uh, over it, the United States reaches a peaceful settlement with Britain. So originally, both Britain and the United States had claimed this territory and some other territory further north. And for a while, it looked like the US might go to war with Britain over it, but eventually we decide just to split it. And so the United States gets the southern chunk and Britain gets the northern chunk. In order to settle this territory, the United States offers free land to white farmers who want to move out and settle the region. Um, and this is popular because there is a big chunk of land right here called the Willamette Valley over here in Western Oregon that is just really excellent farmland. And so people are willing to make the journey all the way across the Great Plains, which nobody wants to settle on, over to the lush valleys of the Pacific Northwest. In order to help this process, the U.S. Army establishes a line of forts going across the Great Plains in order to protect westward migrants. And this sets up the famous Oregon Trail, which is going to allow tens of thousands of white U.S. farmers to move and settle in the Pacific Northwest over the next several decades. Um, so, as a result of this, Oregon is rapidly settled by white Northerners. Basically, there is no slavery in Oregon, and Oregon is going to become a free state. Also, a side effect of this is that the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, who had been up to this point relatively isolated from the destruction caused by colonization in the rest of the continent, are exposed to a whole bunch of new diseases and are basically wiped out and easily removed from the best parts of the best farmland in these regions very quickly. So, yeah, once again, European diseases doing most of the work there. All right, and now our last big chunk. This is the Mexican Cession of 1848. So, as we mentioned before, the annexation of Texas led to a border dispute with Mexico. And the United States is at this point led by a guy named James K. Polk, the 11th president, and he has a single goal for his presidency, which is to expand the United States as far as possible. And so, in order to achieve this goal, he decides to start a war with Mexico. So, what he does is he moves the U.S. Army units into the disputed territory between the Rio Grande and Nueces River, and basically runs around until Mexico starts shooting at them. When Mexico shoots at them, we say Mexico is attacking us. and we declare war on them. The U.S. invades Mexico after a series of, a bunch of different battles. The U.S. is able to march all the way down into Mexico City and to occupy the Mexican capital in a very one-sided and decisive war. After the U.S. Successfully captures Mexico City, we force the Mexicans to sign a peace treaty called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which they cede to us basically half of all their territory. So all of this stuff up here, uh, this is this green area here, including California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Colorado, and Utah. All of that becomes U.S. territory. And that combined with the loss of Texas is about half, if not more than half, of all of the territory of New Spain. And what's really weird about this is that the next year, 1 year after annexing all of this territory, one of the largest gold strikes in history occurs in California, resulting in the California Gold Rush and a massive economic boom that is going to turn California into a rapidly growing state in the next couple years. So it's just really quite strange that this gold was sitting there this whole time, and it's exactly 1 year after the Mexican cession that this happens. But so anyway, short-term effects of this: the gold rush boosts the U.S. economy. All this gold flowing in helps to boost economic growth. This also provides funding and motivates the establishment of railroads connecting the East and the West, trying to connect California and Oregon up to the rest of the U.S. economy. Also leads to arguments over whether these new territories should be free or slave states. And it's actually going to turn out that almost all of this territory is eventually going to become free states because you can't really do plantation agriculture in the desert. And tons and tons and tons of non-slave owning workers moved to California to try and find gold. So in a way, this is actually going to seal the fate of the Southern plantocracy because there's nowhere else for slavery to spread. And this is going to result in California entering the Union as a free state in 1850, which is kind of the beginning of the end for the Southern dominance of the federal government. Okay, so that's all the territories. We covered all the big ones, and now let's talk about the long-term effects of all of this. So anyway, conflict is going to be a big one. This guy, John Brown, we'll talk about him later, but we can see that westward expansion is going to serve as kind of the flashpoint or the catalyst for the coming conflict between the North and the South that is eventually going to break out into the Civil War. So first up, some big social effects of westward expansion. So first of all, you see the spread of U.S. Social structures and culture westward from the East Coast, and it basically happens in just like a straight line. So the northern states tend to be based on small family farms. And that model just continues straight west into the Midwest and then also into Oregon. So this patchwork of small food producing family farms selling their food on the market and then importing industrial goods from the Northeast. In the South, you're also going to see the spread of the existing social structure, which is plantation slavery. So this model that was already developed in the South, in South Carolina and Virginia, is going to spread into the Deep South and into Texas, where it is going to be the main system used to produce cotton during this time period. This also results in the increase of the U.S. population. First of all, by incorporating conquered populations into the U.S. population. So about 30,000, 40,000 French dudes, a bunch of Spanish folks from the Mexican cession, and then also a bunch of indigenous folks who had previously been occupying the territory of other empires. It's also going to result in increasing immigration into the United States, mostly into the free territories of the North, uh, especially folks coming in from Europe, coming in to work as farmers in the Midwest, and folks coming in to work as industrial workers in the growing cities of the North and also the West. Also, as farms spread, population tends to increase, and this is just largely because farms need kids to work. So if you look at this map here, you can see the spread of the US population from 1800, which tends to be clustered over towards the East Coast, spreading out to occupy all this territory east of the Mississippi, and then also the first kind of beginning of the spread of US populations out into the West in Texas, California, Oregon, and also Salt Lake City. Shout out to the Mormons. Okay, so the economic effects of this are huge. First of all, by taking over all of this stuff, this increases the US's access to key natural resources, which is going to help to fuel industrialization. So you've got cheap foodstuffs from the Midwest and also now from Oregon. You've got cotton coming in from the Deep South, and you've also got key mineral resources, especially gold, coming in from Georgia, Colorado, and California, most of all. This helps to speed up industrialization with the creation of a large national market. It means that the US no longer has to import as much stuff from other countries, that we can just produce it ourselves. And also, all these folks living out west need to buy US manufactured goods. So, all these folks are going to be helping to support the factories back in the industrial Northeast. Another important effect of this is that westward migration opens up an era of upward mobility for white families. And this is largely, I think, where the kind of idea of the American dream as upward economic mobility comes from. Because during this time period, it really was the case that basically any white person who wants land can just move to where there is land and acquire it. This might be the farmlands of the Midwest, or it might be the Oregon Valley. But wherever it is, if you can get out there, you can get the land that you need to set up a big farm and make money and, eventually become quite wealthy. So this was a real option for a lot of people. Also, this results in more and more people leaving the industrial cities of the East and heading out west, which results in scarce labor and higher wages in US cities. So even folks who don't go out west benefit from this as a result of higher wages. This leads to one historian, a guy named Frederick Jackson Turner, to articulate the social safety valve theory of US development, basically arguing that the West helps to relieve pressure on US cities and results in a unique political development in the United States. So because we can move out west, American workers can leave the overcrowded cities and go find more opportunities out west. What this means is that working conditions in US cities never get that bad because wages stay high and people can always leave if stuff gets too bad. Also, as a result of this, this prevents the formation of a revolutionary socialist political movement in the United States, which is interesting because if you see in all the European countries where the Industrial Revolution is occurring, you see socialism emerging as a larger and more powerful force during this time period. But in the United States, socialism does not really emerge at all as a major force. And maybe one reason for this is because conditions never get that bad, and you can always leave if you want to improve your condition. And last of all, this is important because as more people leave and go west, this opens up new jobs and opportunities for immigrants coming into the United States. So you get this continuous flow of some people leaving the cities and going west, and then other people coming in to take those spots where you can get decent jobs for high wages. And so that's the West functioning as this safety valve that prevents things from getting too bad in US cities and opens up this kind of unique political development in the United States. Anyway, that's just a theory, but it's been quite influential, and I think there's something there worth considering. All right, so last big thing is political effects. And basically, the political effects of westward expansion is the ongoing competition between the North and the South for control of the federal government. So a key way to control the federal government is to have as many states on your side as possible. And you see a clear split between the interests of the southern states, which are increasingly committed to slavery, and the northern states, which are increasingly opposed to it. So, what this leads to is a competition between the North and the South to control and add as many new states as possible that either do or do not have slavery, depending on North or South. Um, so, at first, this race is pretty even. As westward expansion unfolds, you see the North and the South adding slave and free states at a relatively equal rate. So Mississippi comes in 1817, Indiana comes in 1816. So the balance is maintained. Alabama and Illinois both come in within 1 year of each other, maintaining the balance. Again, with Missouri and Maine. Um, Again, later with, where is it? Texas. Huh. I thought Maine was later. Anyway, but the whole point is as more and more states are added, at first there's for every slave state that gets added, a free state gets added. So this maintains the balance between the North and the South. However, as time goes on, the South kind of runs out of states where slavery works because cotton can only grow kind of in the deep South. So as the U.S. continues to expand further west and further north, um, all of the states that come in after 1848 are free states. So California in 1850, Minnesota in 1858, Oregon in 1859. And this is going to result eventually in the control of the federal government by northern political elites. And this is going to be kind of finalized by the victory of the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln in 1860, which is a Northern party that specifically opposes the expansion of slavery to any new territories. So it's this ongoing political contest in the West that is eventually going to tip off the conflict between the North and the South, as the South realizes that there is no way for it to continue to exert influence and control at the federal level. And so the southern states just break away instead. All right. Well, that's it. Thanks for listening. And I hope you enjoy the lecture and learn stuff, even though I'm not there. Okay, thanks. Bye. All right, let's go.